Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Arab Center, Washington. This is Khalil Jahshan. I'm Executive Director of the Center, and I would like to welcome you to this very special interview with Dr. Shibley Telhami regarding the annexation issue and public opinion in the States, American public opinion, vis-a-vis the policy of the Trump plan regarding the annexation of territory in the West Bank. Shibley doesn't need introduction to Middle East audiences per se, Middle East affairs audiences, but let me go ahead just in case. We have among our guests today people who are not familiar with Shibley. Let me say that he is the non-resident senior fellow at in the project on U.S. relations with the Islamic world and the Center for Middle East Policy and the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institution here in Washington, D.C. He's also the Sadat Professor for Peace and Development at the University of Maryland and has served over the years as senior advisor to the U.S. State Department, as advisor to the U.S. mission to the UN, and advisor to Congressman Lee Hamilton in terms of the congressional foreign policy matters, and served on the Iraq study group back after the Iraq war. Shibley, as you could tell, has basically bridged the gap between academia and public policy, which is rare in Arab American circles, academic included. So we really appreciate the service that he rendered to the country in this respect. He's an expert on U.S. policy in the Middle East, on Arab politics, and on shifting political identities in the Arab world. And most directly related to our visit today, or our conversation today, is his rich experience in conducting public opinion surveys both here in the United States and in the Arab world. His most recent book is The World Through Arab Eyes, Arab Public Opinion and the Reshaping of the Middle East. Dr. Telhami, welcome to Arab Center, Washington.
My pleasure.
July 1st was declared a deadline, a decisive deadline by the Netanyahu government and in terms of the threatened annexation of Palestinian territories. The day arrived and left without any drama as anticipated with the dramatic announcement by Mr. Netanyahu. What's your assessment of the plan and its delay before we get into the public opinion aspect?
Well, first of all, the July 1st deadline was not really a deadline. It was more that there was an agreement that the Israelis would not announce any annexation prior to July 1st. So it's still, they could do it anytime after July 1st. So doesn't mean this issue is over. Obviously, some people expected that it would take place as soon as July 1st. But the context of this is really important. It's not so much that the Israeli government suddenly wants to annex on its own. Obviously, there have been plans. A lot of groups in Israel on the right have wanted to annex parts of the West Bank, if not all of it. And so that itself is not new. What's new here is you have an extraordinary American administration that proposes the annexation of territories in violation of international law. And even in violation of American norms of equality, for example, carving out parts of what is now Israel and taking it out largely because the citizens of the so-called Triangle region are not Jewish. So it's an extraordinary plan, and that's really I think the moment of urgency, because the people on the right who look at this and say, we'll never have a better opportunity. We have an American president with his advisors who are committed to implementing what the Israeli right wing has wanted for a long time. When will we have such a better opportunity? And when you look at it, again, from the perspective of all of everybody else opposing, you could see the opposition to it coming out from the international community, coming today from the Vatican, the Pope, the Vatican invites the US and Israeli ambassador to complain about annexation. And you see what's happening here in terms of unanimous Democratic opposition to annexation at a time when Democrats appear at least poised to retake the White House. All of that is happening, obviously, and so on the right, there's this issue of timing. You know, this is, if they're going to ever do it, this is the time to do it. And so the question is, why aren't they doing it?
Basically, what you just described seems to me as a reversal in the US-Israeli relationship, where usually these types of requests or change in policy tends to be either requested or initiated by the Israeli side and somehow accommodated by the US. This time, you know, what you just described this is an American initiative, essentially, isn't it?
There's no question about it. I mean, look, it's not that the Israelis have not played a part in the formulation of this. Obviously, they were closely coordinating with the Trump administration, but you do have an extraordinary administration or a president who really doesn't follow issues at all, who appointed essentially people who are ideologically committed to parts of the West Bank and the settlement issue. And I'm specifically speaking of two key advisors, obviously, Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law, and also the U.S. ambassador to Israel, David Friedman, whose views had been known for a long time. There is no question that you know, the whole reason why this issue is even a priority. Why would this even be a priority on the Trump administration, given everything that's going on, other than the fact that you have people who really want this done, and obviously working with the Israelis. But the fact is, the Israelis want to do what they want to do, but they haven't done it in the past because you know, American administrations would have opposed annexation, and certainly unilateral annexation, not only because they saw it as conflicting with American interests, but you have to put in perspective here, it's not only that this would be a violation of international law. This is one of the most serious violations of international law. This is a critical international law that underpins the modern international political system. So it's very hard. That's why you have unanimity among Democrats opposing it, including Democratic members of Congress who are very strongly pro-Israel, but they see this as something that is you know, unacceptable, or they can't defend it. They can't defend it to the constituents. Obviously, we could talk about that. But the key here is, yes, it is, you know, it is the Trump administration. They are the ones who are behind this annexation. And there is no way an Israeli government would have even contemplated this idea without the blessing of the Trump administration.
All right, with your permission, let's shift gears a little bit to your survey that you and your colleagues conducted on the first half of March 10th to the 20th, focusing on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and specifically this issue of annexation. And could you give us just briefly the rationale and the methodology, if you will, and the main findings of this survey?
First, let me just say that, you know, we have at the University of Maryland, Critical Issues Poll, which I direct and I partner with my colleague, Professor Stella Rouse, who's a superb Americanist. We together do a lot of polling, not just on Middle East, on international issues broadly, as well as on domestic political issues. We're actually going to release a new study on American politics pretty soon. And we do this regularly. I think you know personally that I've been doing polling on this issue really dating back to the late 1980s.
Sure.
So this is you know, I have really measured this over time, trying to figure out where the public is on issues related particularly to the Arab-Israeli issue. And so put that in perspective. So I repeat a lot of the questions, and therefore I have a sense of studying change over time, although often we have some questions that we only ask for the first time, particularly ones that come up, like the annexation issue that we hadn't asked about. So here, let me just tell you something about the way this was done. So there were questions that were asked of everybody in the sample. This was a large sample, almost 2,400 people carried out by Nielsen Scarborough. And so when we ask people some of the questions that we've asked in the past that were relevant to annexation, for example, we ask if the two-state solution is no longer possible, which of the following would you choose? And we present them with two choices. One is, I choose a democratic Israel where everyone is equal, even if it means that Israel is no longer a Jewish majority state or a Jewish state, or I choose the Jewishness of Israel over its democracy, even if it meant that Israel does not provide equality for all its citizens. So those are the choices. And this one we've asked many times over the years. This is not a new question. And we have found very consistent answers to this question. And as we did in the Marsh survey, which is typically 2/3 of Americans. In this recent survey, we found the same thing, 63% choose democracy over Jewishness, even if it meant that Israel ceases to be a Jewish state. And that includes 81% of Democrats and 70% of independents. So that's one issue that obviously is timely, particularly if there's annexation. And then you conclude the two states, a lot of people have already concluded two states is not possible, but perhaps not the American political mainstream. But a lot of people also say that if there's annexation, it'll become impossible to have a two-state solution. Under that circumstance, it is clear that a majority of American, large majority of American, say they would choose democracy over Jewishness of Israel. So that's an important thing. The second question that we asked of everyone was a more timely one in the sense that, as you know, after the 2018 election, there were a number of members of Congress who were elected on the left, the progressives, so-called, and they have raised many more questions about the Israeli-American relationship. And you've had members on the right, including Democrats, who are saying it's unacceptable to challenge the relationship. That's not something that's acceptable. So we put that out to see where the public is on this, whether it's acceptable, it's not acceptable, it's a duty of a member to defend the relationship, it's a duty of a member to question the relationship. And that too is really interesting. And frankly, this one, I had no idea how it'd come out because we had never asked it before. So it was really kind of, trying to figure out where the public is. And what's interesting, again, you have 2/3 of Americans who say basically it's either acceptable or the duty of members of Congress to question the relationship. And that includes majorities of not only Democrats, among Democrats, the overwhelming majority, but also majorities of independents and Republican who say it's either acceptable or it's the duty of members to question the relationship. That tells me that something has changed. I mean, you and I have been working with Washington for a long time where it was hard for Congress, even if the rank and file had, certainly questioned the relationship up to a point. The American political mainstream, it was an axiomatic thing about not questioning the relationship. There were always members who did, to be fair. It's not that it is highly unusual, but not on the scale that we're beginning to see, and certainly not in terms of transformation of public opinion along these lines. Particularly, keep in mind, while we don't have a historical study of this question, so I can't tell you this wasn't the case 15 years ago, but what's interesting in this particular case is we are in perhaps the most partisan period of our time, where the issue of Israel has become extremely partisan, where people are incredibly divided on the issue of Israel, where the Republicans want to take Israel's side in large numbers, Democrats want to be even-handed in huge numbers. And so on this issue, though, the fact that you have majorities who in principle are open to questioning the relationship, that's something telling. In addition to those broad questions that we asked of everyone, the entire sample of 2,400, we then designed a poll trying to figure out how people have reacted to the Trump plan, as well as what the views are on annexation. So, but here, you have to remember to be realistic about where people are. Like, on most international issues, the American public doesn't follow the specifics in general anyway. But right now, as you can tell, I mean, this is an incredible period of our time. We are in the middle of values war, identity war, a pandemic, the racial issue at the forefront. And all of that, of course, means that, there's not even there isn't much bandwidth to pay attention to much of, I mean, all you have to do is turn on the television and see we're talking either about the pandemic or the racial issues of Trump, or some other derivative of that issue. So this is not obviously a hot issue of the day. And so we wanted to kind of find out how many people are familiar with the plan. And it's roughly 70% of the people are, say, either they're unfamiliar or they're not very familiar. Roughly, you have 30% of the people who are either very familiar or somewhat familiar with the plan. So all the questions that we posed were to those people who were at least somewhat familiar. We didn't want to, obviously, the unfamiliar, you don't ask questions. So that's the context in which we asked the questions.
Excellent. This is really a surprising number. I mean, when you have a total of almost 70% who are not familiar with a policy that has been elevated by this administration, as you said earlier, to a top priority foreign policy issue. There is a gap here. How come, people out there, including their own constituents, do not seem to be informed or to be somehow mobilized, if you will, in support of a policy that the administration is betting on to use as a main foreign policy crutch for the elections?
Well, here's the other thing that, just to focus even more specifically, it obviously applies to evangelical Christians, the evangelical right, which has obviously become a core base for the president. And clearly a constituency that theoretically should care a lot about this issue. And certainly the president has dealt with it that way. The media has highlighted it as if he's doing it for the evangelicals. And it turns out, frankly, just like the rest of the population, more than 2/3 of them are not following this issue. So that's true even of the evangelical grassroots. They're not following this issue. In any case, they probably, while they are in principle supportive of Israel, so when we ask them, do you want the United States to be supportive of Israel or not? A large majority say yes. So they're supportive in principle, but they don't follow, annexation or not annexation. They don't know the differences as much as people might think. And so in my own opinion, and based on a study I've been doing among evangelicals, I'm writing a book. I'm actually writing one book on evangelicals called Evangelicals, Politics, and Israel that I've been researching for 4 years. And it's based on additional data that I've had, including polls among evangelicals, interviews across the board. And I'm also co-authoring a sequel to our peace puzzle on American policy for under Obama and Trump. And so we're doing a lot of interviews with the Trump administration to see what's driving policy. And I could tell you my own conclusion so far with regard to the evangelicals. While evangelical leaders take positions, and mostly to accommodate their allies in the political system, the evangelical rank and file are not driving this issue. So they are soldiers, they're mobilized. They're mobilized to support decisions that are made by the administration, by Trump's advisors, by Trump himself, by his administration. They're mobilized because in principle they're supportive of Israel, but they're not driving this issue. And they will never leave the president, no matter what he does on annexation, because he's given them everything they want on issues related to the Supreme Court or judges broadly or religious schools or access. All of the things that they have wanted all along. This is not one that stands out. So I think we have to keep in mind that this hypothesis that the evangelicals are driving the president's decision is erroneous. Now, I'm wouldn't be surprised if the advisors are saying to him, this will also help you electorally in order to persuade him to go along with their policy. And in fact, he can use it that way. But frankly, it wouldn't make much of a difference, no matter what he does on this issue among evangelicals. So with Democrats too, again, they may not be following this issue. They have views on the issue, right? So it's not that they don't have views. It is that they're not following the details because they don't have the bandwidth to follow the details right now.
I noticed in the questions that you have used in your survey, you did basically seek to expose, if you will, the perception of the respondents vis-a-vis the plan itself in a very kind of simple way, considering kind of the limited depth, if you will, of the knowledge of the plan. Is the plan fair or not fair? Is it even-handed or is it biased? What were the results of this particular one, and was it did it have party affiliation significance there?
Yeah, so let's start with, I told you the first thing we found out is who is somewhat familiar with the plan. We asked those people, and initially we asked them without giving them any additional information. You don't want to lead them into conclusions or try to give them ideas that might bias their answer. So without giving them any additional information, we asked straightforward questions. If their view is favorable, unfavorable of the plan, for example, of those who said they're somewhat familiar. And there you have more people who have unfavorable views than favorable views, and clearly along partisan lines, where overwhelmingly the Democrats have unfavorable views, Republicans have more favorable views, although less overwhelmingly, and independents also have unfavorable views. Then we ask, in your opinion, is the Trump plan too pro-Palestinian, too pro-Israeli, or about the right balance? And there you find very few people, even among Republicans, Democrats, or independents, say it's too pro-Palestinian. So there's a sense, in fact, I think it's like 8% or 9% of all who say it's too pro-Palestinian. The difference is between the large segment that says it's too pro-Israeli and people who say it's too balanced. It is balanced. And here you have complete partisan divide. A majority of Democrats say it's too pro-Israeli. A majority of Republicans say it's balanced. They don't say it's too pro-Palestinian. So that's the basic. And then we asked questions specifically about the annexation. And here we start introducing information, because it's hard not to introduce information if you want to tease out where they stand. We have a bottom line question, but we wanted to give them argument for or against annexation. And what we did is we picked out 4 arguments, 2 against it and 2 for it, based on the discourse, using what the administration and its backers have used to support annexation and what Democrats and others have used against it. The 2 arguments against it were international law and Palestinian rights. Those are the 2. On the other side of the coin, we use the argument about reality on the ground, which is what the Trump people use, and biblical claims, which is another one that they use. And on that issue, it's a huge partisan divide, right? The Democrats overwhelmingly, it's international law and Palestinian rights. Republicans are biblical claims and reality on the ground. But when you go to the bottom line, after you go through all these arguments and you ask the question, okay, now tell me, do you support annexation? Do you oppose it? Far more people oppose it than support it, even with all of those arguments. There's more opposition than support for annexation among the entire population. But obviously, again, there's a partisan divide with a strong opposition, not only by Democrats, but also independents and support among Republicans. Independents actually are pretty divided on this one.
Shibley, with your extensive experience in polling in this country, let me conclude with a general kind of question. In light of the domestic upheaval we're seeing in American society, in light of the pandemic and the pressures, domestic and global, generated by that and impacting the economy at home and abroad, do you see a change in general in American public opinion, and does it translate in terms of the Middle East or the Israeli-Palestinian issue specifically?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think there's no question there's been change. Now, let me tell you what the change is and how it relates to politics. You know, in the past 3 decades of polling, I could tell you that it used to be the case that it's always been the case that a majority of Americans want the U.S. to take neither side of the conflict, to be neutral. Always, that has been true every time. The difference was that among the minority, and that minority ranged from 20 to 30% or 35%, who wanted the U.S. to take sides, a majority of both Republican and Democrats wanted to take Israel's side more, among those who care and want to take sides. That has been the case. What has happened over the years is that increasingly among Republicans, a majority, small majority, but still a majority now say they want to take Israel's side outright, not be even-handed. While an overwhelming majority of Democrats, over 80%, say they want the US to take neither side. And among those Democrats who say they want the US to take sides, they're roughly evenly divided between Israelis and Palestinians, and sometimes among young Democrats, even slightly tilting toward the Palestinians. So that's been a big picture change. Now, has it made a difference in Democratic opinion? Yes, it has on multiple levels. We could see that in terms of the questioning of the relationship, but we also can see that even on things that are surprising. It's still relatively taboo until recently to say that you'd use American, to tie American aid to policy of Israel. We've seen that in the past week in particular, where you've had a number of members of Congress, including Bernie Sanders, who was just a shot away from being a nominee for the Democratic Party for president, who have written to Secretary of State Pompeo saying that, they should be costs in terms of aid if Israel were to go through with annexation. We've heard things from other prominent people who are mainstream, like Senator Chris Van Hollen, who said not so much cutting, all aid to Israel, but sort of like, but American taxpayers shouldn't be subsidizing annexation kind of argument. That's new. Well, at the grassroots of Democratic Party, they've been there for a long time. So, for example, in the past few years, I've been doing the polling on the settlement issue, whether or not Democrats think that the U.S. should do nothing or limit its opposition to words or apply sanctions or more serious measures to respond to expansion of Israeli settlements. And we had a majority of, over 60% of Democrats who say the U.S. should to support sanctions or even more serious measures. So the Democratic grassroots have been there. And obviously this question that I raised about the acceptability of questioning the relationship with the overwhelming majority of Democrats saying it is acceptable, even a duty of members of Congress to do so. Now, does that have a consequence for policy? Now, let's keep this in perspective. In terms of elections, and this particular election in 2020, of course not. What do I mean, of course not? The presidential election in particular. And I would even say the general election as well for members of Congress. Look, I mean, this is not a season about any issue for that matter. It is we're in the middle of an identity war, of a values war, of a Trumpism versus everything else. And very few issues are going to matter, frankly. And this one is not going to play. It's not going to persuade people. It's not going to tip people one way or the other. It isn't going to be that. Where it's going to matter, and it has mattered in this electoral cycle, is at the level of primaries, at the level of maybe the platform of the Democratic Party, and it will matter down the road if you have a Democratic Senate majority, you have a Democratic president. We've seen things that are really interesting in the past few years, not only in terms of more members of Congress who are asking questions that were not asked in the past. But we've seen things like what Bernie Sanders demonstrated in 2016 and this time around, where while the issue of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not a top priority for Americans, or for that matter, for Democrats, it's still part and parcel of a worldview. It is part and parcel of a value system that, while we're in the middle of a values war, where it's Democrats belong or see themselves as belonging to a definition of America where it's about egalitarianism, it's about democracy, it's about human rights, it's about equality, it's about the rule of law, it's about multilateralism, it's about international law, it's about global human rights. And the Israel-Palestine issue has been already part of this discourse about values. And because you have an Israeli government that has, even before Trump came into office, associated itself with republicanism, particularly in the debate on the Iran deal, and the Prime Minister of Israel taken a very aggressive position against the sitting popular Democratic President Barack Obama, and speaking to a joint session of Congress against the Iran nuclear deal, which the President of the United States made a priority issue for himself. And now, in the past 3.5 years, being a very close ally of a president that Democrats abhor, and many Americans abhor. And as a consequence, really alienated, seem to be sitting outside of the value system of Democrats. And so it's become a prototype about consistency in values. What that has done is that if you are a member, if you're a politician, and you raise the question of equality and freedom or human rights on the Israeli-Palestinian front, you're likely to score points. People see you more as an authentic advocate of the values they care about. And if you avoid it, they see you as being less authentic, and they reward you if you're authentic. And we've seen that Bernie Sanders proved it, that he actually energized his base by making it into an issue, both in terms of maybe raising funds, arguably, and certainly a lot of young people doing it. And clearly, we've seen in this round of Democratic primaries, the presidential primaries, we've seen how this energy, nobody wanted to be on the side of Bibi Netanyahu. That wasn't, even including, centrist Democrats like Joe Biden, who wasn't going to refer to the aid to Israel. He found himself forced to say, I find everything that Netanyahu does is unacceptable, or things along these lines. In the more recent weeks, the victory of Jamal Bowman in the 16th District of New York is really telling. And it's telling not, obviously these things happen in politics, and we've seen them in the past. And politicians, longtime politicians, get, too comfortable, and somebody young and energetic comes and overtakes them. But in this particular case, it was telling, in large part because Bowman made an issue of the Palestinian question, made an issue. against a long-term powerful member of the House, chair of a very important committee in the House of Representatives, who has been very closely associated with supporting Israel and had been backed by groups supporting Israel and who mobilized behind him to make sure he wins. And rather than shying away from confronting the issue, Bowman made it an issue. And we don't know if it helped him or hurt him, but it certainly didn't hurt him. It may have helped him. It certainly didn't help him, but he energized his base. And it looks like, obviously the final results we don't have, but based on what we now know, he probably won by a very wide margin. And that's very interesting. And I think that's going to be studied, and it's going to be, looked at by other candidates in other districts as we move forward.
That is certainly a very interesting and probably historic case that we will continue to analyze for a long time to come. Shibley, thank you so much for your generosity and time and spending this period with us to discuss this very important issue. I would like to encourage all those watching this interview, if you want a little bit more information, to basically Google Dr. Shibley Telhami at Brookings, brookings.edu, and look up particularly this last summary report if you're interested in a quick survey of what he just discussed, what Americans think about the looming Israeli annexation and Trump's Middle East plan. But within that, you can basically click on some more detail about the survey and the survey's results. Again, thank you for your attention. Thank you for participation, and we hope to see you again in a future event with Arab Center of Washington.
My pleasure.